Y'all know that saying, surround yourself with people smarter than you. Well, I had the privilege in my tenure at WildEarth Guardians to work and learn from our next speaker. Lizzy Pennock is a carnivore coexistence advocate at WildEarth Guardians. She works protecting native carnivores in the Northern Rockies from livestock conflicts on lands currently managed by the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. She started interning with WildEarth Guardians Wildlife Program as a law student and worked as a Diehl Environmental Law Fellow before starting her current role. In addition to promoting coexistence between native carnivores and livestock, she also works on bringing down Wildlife Services, the federal agency responsible for the killing of thousands of native carnivores, primarily at the behest of the livestock industry. Lizzy has been a passionate environmental advocate for the past decade, focused on both land and marine wildlife conservation. She has a BS in marine science from the University of Hawaii and a JD from Lewis and Clark Law School with a certificate in environmental and natural resources law. Lizzy, thank you for your work and for being a part of this conference. I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Thank you, Rosie. Okay, let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen. I think I didn't have the security up. Can you guys share it for me?
Amanda, are you able to?
I've never shared a screen on Zoom before, and it's having me go to my system preferences. I'm not an IT person, so I don't know how to do this.
Just one moment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Amanda, are you working on that? There we go.
There you go. Just let me know when you want me to forward.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Rosie, thank you for that introduction. I'm Lizzy. I'm the carnivore coexistence advocate at WildEarth Guardians. I am based in Missoula, Montana. I'm on the ancestral, traditional, and stolen lands of the Salish and Kootenai people. It is truly an honor to be here speaking to all of you who are listening. Thank you all for your time and energy, and also to speak among all these other presenters, many of whom I've gone to for advice in the past as I have navigated the beginning of my career. So this is really a humbling experience for me. And Speak for Wolves board members, thank you for all your work to put this together and bring us all into this space. Throughout my presentation, you're going to see a lot of really gorgeous wildlife photos, and those are all from Sam Park's Wild Ecosystem Images, and you can see the little logo on the photos if you're interested in finding more of their work. It's really, really beautiful. So today I'm going to be talking about the federal legal authority and responsibility to mitigate and prevent livestock carnivore conflicts on lands that are currently managed by the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, which I will refer to as the Bureau. And then I will also refer to these agencies as the agencies or the federal land management agencies, just so you all know what I'm talking about. And I want to acknowledge too that although I'm talking about lands managed by these federal agencies, WildEarth Guardians recognizes that these lands are lands stewarded by and home to Indigenous peoples since time immemorial and to this day, and they do not belong to the federal government. Next slide, please. Thanks, Amanda. WildEarth Guardians is a 501c3 environmental nonprofit, and we work all over the West to protect landscapes, wildlife, rivers, and the climate of the American West. I'm in the wildlife program, and I focus, like Rosie said, on native carnivore livestock conflicts in the Northern Rockies, mostly on federal lands. So I'm going to give you the basics of my presentation, and then we will dive in. So I'm going to provide the context that allows for these conflicts to occur. I'm going to show you, although I suspect many of you already know, why we need action by the federal government, like yesterday. I'm going to give you an example of how these conflicts play out in the absence of any federal action to protect carnivores from livestock. I'm going to talk about the coexistence measures that land management agencies can put in place to reduce these conflicts. And then I'm going to show you, and this is the boring part, I'll show you that the federal land management agencies have the legal authority and the legal responsibility to fix these problems and manage more for wildlife than they are right now. And then I'll talk about what Guardians is doing to drive this change. We have done a lot of work in the past on wildlife services reform, and we are switching our tactic to focusing on holding the federal land management agencies accountable for these conflicts, because they're managing these lands and they're permitting the grazing of the livestock on these lands. And it's some of the best native carnivore habitat in the country. And so they should be responsible for mitigating and preventing these conflicts as our native carnivores expand throughout their historic range and live in their native habitat. And then towards the end of my presentation, we'll discuss how Guardians is trying to urge these agencies to change their practices for livestock grazing from the top down. Next slide, please. So this is the context. Livestock and wildlife live together on a bunch of land managed by these two federal agencies. And there are some statistics on this slide that just to show the scale of the potential for conflict. So the Bureau administers 63% of the lands it manages for livestock grazing, which is 155 million acres. The Forest Service administers about 40% of the land it manages for livestock grazing, and that's 74 million acres. The Forest Service has over 1 million cattle and almost 800,000 sheep and goats on Forest Service lands. And then you can see on the slide, I just put, there's almost 18,000 grazing permits and leases active right now on Bureau lands. And I couldn't find the same statistic for the Forest Service, but I found how many grazing permittees were active a couple years ago, which is probably very similar to what it is now. And that's just in the Western regions. And a lot of these grazing permits are in some of the best habitat. So an interesting figure I came up with when I was making this presentation, almost half of the Bureau grazing permits, so like 9,000 grazing permits and leases across 15 states are concentrated in 3, and that's Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And not only is this where a lot of our native carnivores reside and find the highest quality habitat, but it's also where they're persecuted by state game agencies and those who want to kill wolves. So that's the grazing context and the livestock conflict text. But on the same lands is some of the nation's best wildlife habitat. So on Bureau and Forest Service lands, there's over 6,000 species of wildlife, not including plants. The Bureau manages 300 species that are listed on the Endangered Species Act, and the Forest Service manages 430. So clearly these are ecologically diverse lands, which makes for great habitat. And as private development continues to increase and the climate change and biodiversity crises worsen, these lands should provide an oasis for our native carnivores. And they largely don't, because the federal government continues to place consumptive and destructive uses over conservation and wildlife. And not only is the habitat on these lands important for the native carnivores, but the native carnivores are incredibly important for the continued functioning of this habitat. And their importance stretches to all the species that we just talked about that reside in the same space. Native carnivores are apex predators, so they have an outsized influence on the ecosystems that they're a part of. They stabilize the ecosystems. They have direct effects. They have indirect effects on animals, plants, and they promote biodiversity and ecosystem balance. And I think we're all familiar with what happened in Yellowstone when wolves were brought back. That's not just a Yellowstone thing. That's what happens when a habitat is allowed to exist as it should and have its apex predators. So clearly, these agencies need to be managing their lands and the things that they permit to happen on their lands with native wildlife in mind. And for the most part, they're just totally abdicating this responsibility. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So when there are conflicts between these livestock and the carnivores on federally managed lands, carnivores die. The greatest threat to carnivores like wolves and grizzly bears is human intolerance and human-based conflict. This includes mortality from illegal poaching, which I know others have talked about, government-sanctioned hunting and trapping, and lethal removal actions from conflicts with wildlife or conflicts with livestock, which is a really big problem, especially for wolves. And then grizzly bears get in a lot of trouble for livestock, as well as chicken coops, food, garbage, just a lot of things that humans bring onto the landscape that are unnatural cause these carnivores to die. And just to get an example of the killing is the West-wide activities of wildlife services. This is the Federal Wildlife Killing Agency, and it's a poignant example of conflict-based government-sponsored killing on a broad scale, largely in the absence of efforts at coexistence driven by the federal government. So here's some data. In 2020, Wildlife Services killed 67,000 native carnivores. Most of them were coyotes, as well as almost 400 gray wolves and 5 Mexican gray wolves. And this is largely at the behest of the livestock industry. And they're not just killing them, but they're killing them in cruel ways. They use poison, strangulation, body crushing traps. They gun down animals from helicopters. They gas pups in their dens, and it's all on the taxpayer's dime. But Wildlife Services doesn't act alone. Both of the federal land management agencies that my presentation is focused on have contracts with Wildlife Services, or documents that show the understanding between the two agencies about when they're going to kill carnivores and what level of reporting, or what's the threshold for when that's going to be an acceptable practice. And then that's just the federal killing, right? So there's also state and private actors contributing to the bloodshed for livestock producers under a patchwork of state laws, regulations, and non-binding suggestions, which determine when carnivores will get killed for livestock producers. Next slide, please. So the Colville National Forest, which Lynn talked about a lot earlier in her really informative presentation, is a great example of how livestock carnivore conflicts play out in the absence of federal action to protect carnivores from livestock or any federal responsibility at all. This is one of the most egregious examples of the failure of the U.S. Forest Service to take responsibility to manage their lands to protect wildlife, instead of placing livestock grazing above all else, despite a mountain of evidence that of the harm it causes on so many different levels, not just to carnivores. So this picture, this is from the U.S. Forest Service. This is actually the Colville National Forest, and you can see there are those are cows, those little dots down there. And that's actually a decent space for cows to be because it's open and defensible. But what I really want you to see with this picture is behind that. Look how densely forested and mountainous that terrain is. The whole forest is essentially like that, or most of it is covered with this thick conifer. And in this area, this is Northeast Washington. This is where most of Washington's wolf population growth has occurred. And these densely forested areas, they're great for wolves and they're dangerous for livestock. It's harder for them to stay in a herd. It's harder for people to defend them, and they become very easy targets. And yet, the Forest Service administers at least 68% of this forest as grazing allotments. So that's 745,000 acres of densely forested terrain that cows are getting turned out on. Every summer, the Forest Service allows nearly 10,000 cows and young calves to graze on the Colville National Forest. This happens from June 1st to mid-autumn, and this overlaps the period when wolves are most active around their dens and rendezvous sites. And that's a term I'm going to use a couple times, so I'm going to explain it just in case. Rendezvous sites are more open areas than, say, the den. And they're kind of the home base for activities for wolves after denning, but before the winter. So pups come here after they're weaned and they hang out there and they learn how to woof until they're old enough to hunt with the pack. So really important areas for wolves. And a wolf pack usually has a handful of these sites. So clearly somewhere we don't want livestock. But regardless of the data, regardless of the knowledge, regardless of years and years and years of conflicts, no one has changed anything. And the Forest Service hasn't changed the grazing practices. They just continue to allow the same thing to happen. And not surprisingly, there have been repeated conflicts. Over 90% of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's 34 wolf kills between 2012 and 2020 were completely or partly in response to predation of federally permitted cattle on this forest. So that's the whole state. Most of it is happening in this one forest. And the majority of those, as some of us know, is because of one producer. This one producer's cattle cause the majority of conflicts in the entire state. And that's because the Colville National Forest managers permit them to graze cattle in prime wolf habitat, including pastures that contain these core wolf areas like rendezvous sites and dens, leading to the same conflicts year after year with different wolves because they kill the wolves. So this has resulted in the destruction of 5 wolf packs over 2012 to 2020. And someone asked Lynn earlier in her talk about Washington's wolves, what can we do? Because it can be really difficult to take action. And that's why Guardians is starting to focus on the federal land management agencies. This is on Forest Service land. These cattle are permitted by the Forest Service, and the Forest Service has still done absolutely nothing to require any conflict reduction measures in the operating instructions for grazing in these areas, even though they have the authority to do so. Because a lot of coexistence measures are through livestock husbandry and grazing regulation and grazing methods, and they could prevent a lot of these conflicts. Next slide, please. So what can they do? What are the coexistence measures that they can require through the grazing permitting process? So you'll see on this slide a handful of the coexistence measures that we think should be required by the agencies to mitigate and prevent the totally unnecessary conflicts that are currently happening when they permit livestock to go in areas where conflict is likely to happen. And a lot of them are just common sense, and the agencies can do it through their permitting process. They just aren't. So some coexistence measures are based on the physical location of the livestock. For example, the agencies could say you can't turn your cattle out into densely forested terrain in prime wolf habitat or in areas where wolves are known or likely to be, like the Colville. Or they can just say this area is unsuitable for grazing, and they can require cattle to be somewhere else, like those open defensible spaces that we talked about earlier, where coexistence measures can actually be effective. And this is important because, like, even if the Forest Service still allows grazing in these densely forested areas, but then they say, well, you need to have a range rider too. Well, that's incredibly difficult for a range rider to defend those cows in that densely forested, rugged terrain. It's hard for the cows. It's hard for people to be there with the cows. And so if they're not willing to say this is not suitable grazing habitat, which is what they need to do, then it's not really going to make a difference long term. Other things they can do is require a buffer zone, say a 1 mile buffer zone between active wolf areas like dens and rendezvous sites and livestock, and then make sure cattle can be kept to that buffer zone through active herding or fencing or other measures. Some coexistence measures are based on timing. So to reduce predation on calves, which are quite small, maybe a couple 100 pounds, producers can wait until native ungulates are giving birth, and that provides other easy meal options on the landscape. Some of the most successful coexistence measures are the use of guard animals like livestock guardian dogs and llamas, and human presence, like with range riders, when done correctly, are some of the most effective means to reduce conflict. Carcass removal and proper disposal are really big. That protects wolves and grizzlies, because when those carnivores are drawn into an area by a carcass, particularly grizzly bears, they're scavengers. They are then drawn towards the living livestock that are then putting those carnivores at risk, and those livestock are at risk as well. And it's usually a mix of these measures implemented together on an adaptive basis that's the most effective way to prevent or to protect carnivores from livestock. And we do have producers that are doing this with great success. Lastly, the agencies need to make this enforceable. They can revoke or suspend grazing permits and authorization if the terms are not complied with. And this is key. Having non-binding or unenforceable measures rarely makes a difference. We're seeing this in Washington state, where the department's wolf plan has non-binding coexistence suggestions, and they can authorize lethal action regardless of whether or not those have been followed. And it's just not going to be enough. We need requirements. We need enforceable, non-lethal coexistence measures in place before wolves die. And that is what the federal agencies could do. So next slide, please. This is the legal part. Bear with me. So what authority do they have, and why do they have the responsibility to manage for livestock? We can clearly see that these measures are needed on these federally managed lands. So first, I'm going to go over the authority of each agency to manage grazing, and then the authority and responsibility that they have to conserve wildlife, and how that can be done through the grazing framework. So our first law, FLTMA, is the Federal Land and Policy Management Act, and it authorizes the Forest Service and the Bureau to permit livestock grazing on certain lands. So Congress wrote FLTMA, and FLTMA governs these agencies, and it's kind of, big scale. Congress can't say, here are all the details of your job, agency. So Congress makes this big picture law, and then the agencies take that and develop more specific regulations that govern their activities. And a lot of these regulations have the force and effect of law. To manage their lands, the U.S. Forest Service creates forest plans, and the Bureau creates resource management plans. And these are for very large landscapes, large swaths of land. And then and that governs any activity that they're going to do, which includes grazing, which includes conservation, which includes mining, oil and gas. Many, many things are included in those plans. At a smaller scale, the agencies develop more specific plans for particular activities or land uses, like allotment management plans for grazing allotments. And then at an even smaller scale, grazing is administered on the agency lands through a permit system. So a grazing permit is the official written permission to graze livestock on a particular allotment. And it includes all the details of grazing, like the number and class of livestock, the authorized period of use, things like that. Okay, so that's the legal authority that the agencies have to regulate grazing. So what's their authority and what's their responsibility to regulate wildlife? Because each agency is responsible for managing wildlife on its lands, and it's explicitly stated in both the laws that govern them and the regulations that the agencies have created to implement those laws. So FLTMA, the Federal Land and Policy Management Act, directs the Bureau to manage for multiple uses. And this includes wildlife and fish. Congress declared in FLTMA that the Bureau needs to manage its lands in a manner that will provide food and habitat for wildlife, and that will protect the quality of ecological and environmental values, among others. The Forest Service is governed by the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, and I won't say that again, so don't worry. Congress put wildlife and fish among the multiple uses that the Forest Service has to manage for. And this law gave the Forest Service broad discretion to manage when conflicts between uses arise. And here's our last law governing grazing and wildlife is NIFMA, the National Forest Management Act. It imposes specific duties on the Forest Service to manage and conserve wildlife. And through this law, Congress established wildlife diversity as a central component of Forest Service planning and management. And then the agency's regulations, which it developed under FLIPMA, ensure that the Forest Service make sure that the Forest Service has viable wildlife populations. So yes, each agency is responsible for managing multiple uses on the lands they currently oversee, but they can't simply ignore wildlife in favor of livestock grazing and the other consumptive uses that they authorize as they regularly do. And here's where the enforcement piece can come in. Each agency's regulations governing grazing allow modification or cancellation of grazing permits or leases if grazing fails to meet management objectives that are specified in those big landscape level plans. So if the agencies put implementation of coexistence measures into the large landscape level plans, it will go down and have a top-down effect all the way down to grazing permits and leases if the agency enforces it. So this national framework, this programmatic framework of coexistence measures could impact grazing through individual grazing permits. Next slide, please. So how do we get them to do this? Because a lot of really smart people who care a lot about this issue have been trying for a very long time. And it's very difficult to get the agencies to change the way that they manage something or to when they can manage between multiple uses, they are given a lot of discretion by the courts. So litigation on this topic is very difficult. So what WildEarth Guardians is doing to drive this agenda to urge these federal land management agencies to implement coexistence through their grazing management is we are filing 2 petitions under the Administrative Procedure Act, one each to each agency. So the Administrative Procedure Act is a law that allows the public to submit petitions for rulemaking by the agencies. And then when an agency engages in formal rulemaking, the rule that results is the same force and effect of law. Sadly, the agency doesn't have to engage in formal rulemaking. They can deny the petition, which can then be challenged in court, or they can just delay it for like 10 years. And then at that point, it becomes challengeable in court for like a failure to act. Obviously, our end goal is for them to respond to the petitions and begin the rulemaking process. We want a rule in place by both agencies that directs that the management plans within their jurisdictions covering forests or entire regions to plans covering grazing allotments, they need to require implementation of these and other coexistence measures to mitigate and prevent these useless conflicts on lands where they are saying, yes, go ahead, cattle, and where we can tell it's likely that conflicts are going to occur. Within the coming months, we will be sending these petitions to the agencies, and we will share them widely within the community for support. And you can hop on wildearthguardians.org and you can sign up for email alerts and get action alerts, and you can keep up with these efforts to do this. In sum, it is way past time for the federal land management agencies to start managing the absolutely destructive grazing that they permit on our shared lands, on these incredibly important lands for wildlife in a way that prevents these unnecessary conflicts. So with that, we can open it up for questions if we have any.
We have quite a bit of questions, Lizzy.
Okay.
Thank you for allowing us some time. This first question, and thank you so much for your presentation. That was very comprehensive, but thank you for making it easy to understand. Appreciate it. So this question comes from Linda Shaw. I'm not a meat eater, but has there been any thought to produce a wolf-safe beef label to use to be used by certified producers, like dolphin-safe tuna ideas, so at least consumers who care have a choice not to support wolf killing by their purchase? Anything along those lines?
That's a really interesting idea. That I like a lot. I'm not personally aware of anything like that. I wouldn't be surprised if something like that was happening, but what you can do is find producers that are doing this. Like there are some, I think it's the Anderson Family Ranch and the Tom Minor
Basin Association.
Yeah, exactly. And they are they're right in grizzly wolf habitat, and they're out there grazing their livestock, and they implement a lot of these coexistence measures. So I really like the idea of a wolf safe label or a carnivore safe label, and hopefully that happens one day. Until that day, you can generally find producers that are doing these things in the right way, and then hopefully figure out where to get your beef or other products from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lizzy. Can you speak to what you think is the primary hesitation for the Forest Service to integrate science into these plans? How much money are they really making from grazing on public lands?
That's a good question. They make very little money. We lose money on grazing. It's a losing venture. It costs $1.35 per cow calf pair, I think, per month to graze. And like 97% of the beef that we produce here, we ship it out of the country. So we make very little money, and we are suffering like all of the consequences. But now I'm on a tangent and I forgot what the question was.
The question was really how much money the Forest Service is making, and if that is a factor in why they're being so lenient and lax with
what's their hesitation. Yes. Right. Okay. Politics. I think it's politically unsavory to limit things like grazing. I think a big theme of this presentation has been the outsized voice and political sway of those we might classify as our opponents on wolf or similar work. And they are just extremely powerful, wealthy, well organized, and they're really plugged in. So politically, it's very difficult to get the bureaucracy to say, yes, we are going to limit grazing, even though they don't make money. It's just politically, it's extremely difficult.
Thank you. Hopefully we can see a change of that in the future.
Yes.
This is from Michelle Wright. Are there any agency actions to manage the farmer/rancher in Eastern Washington who's causing all the deaths of the wolves? Reduce grazing permits, limit area, anything?
Not that I know of. That's a tough one. There is ongoing litigation. Because it's ongoing, I can't say much about it, but we are going after that situation and trying to hold the federal government responsible for what's happening.
Thank you, Lizzy. And this one is from anonymous attendee. It's a narrative, so let me just read this to you. Okay. As a resident of Eastern Washington, I have found a lot of pushback from the state Fish and Wildlife Department when I contact them about livestock carnivore conflicts, and I've had much luck with communicating with my local congressional representatives. What actions can I take to make my voice heard on the federal levels on behalf of wolves to push for these mitigative measures when it comes to grazing?
That's a great question. It's a lot of it is commenting. So the agencies, when they engage in any sort of like forest planning, which because these plans last for a very long time, it doesn't happen very often, but you can comment and you can say what you want to say and you can make your voice heard. So you can look at like the Federal Register. I think it's just like fedreg.org or .gov. Just Google Federal Register, and through there you can find where these agencies are posting the different parts of their rulemakings. Unfortunately, for smaller actions like grazing permits, because of a legal loophole that I will try not to nerd out too much about, they don't have to do a lot of the public transparency pieces of renewing those grazing permits. So there's a law called the National Environmental Policy Act, and it's supposed to give us, the public, a voice in what's happening. And instead, there's now this loophole that says they can essentially just keep putting out the same permits over and over again without doing this process. So it's incredibly difficult, and getting more difficult to have the public's voice heard. And you can also support all the amazing organizations, many of them have spoken this weekend, who are doing this work through litigation, or like what we're doing with the APA petitions. There's so many people doing this work that you can support. And I think Lynn earlier said you can sign up for action alerts, which we keep track of the Federal Register. So we will tell you, I should have said that to begin with. You don't have to do that. You can just sign up to receive email alerts from us or other similar organizations, and they will make it very easy for you to send a letter to the editor or provide a comment. So just follow those organizations.
Thank you, Lizzy. This one, I don't know who this one's from, but isn't Wildlife Services prohibited from killing wolves in Washington State based on filings ruling by WELC, Western Environmental Law Center?
I don't know if it was WELC for sure.
Right.
It wouldn't surprise me at all. But yes, Wildlife Services can't kill wolves in Washington. And this is one of the reasons why we're kind of switching tacks to the federal land management agencies, because when Wildlife Services stops killing wolves, the state just picks up where they left off. And the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is now the agency that kills wolves instead.
Thank you. And then this one is from Esther. And Esther, I might have you clarify this question. Maybe, Lizzy, you might understand it. Since there is a drought, does the BLM USDA not consider the lack of resources, especially when it applies to exports?
I don't know. I mean, they might. I know drought's a huge issue and it's impacting a lot of land uses, but I think the agencies are typically pretty slow on the uptake, particularly when it comes to environmental problems. So I'm not aware of any big actions either agency has taken to protect, these lands from drought. And I know that there's a lot of people really upset about the drought, understandably, who do this for their full-time job. And I haven't heard anything, so I'm not positive about that, but I don't think so.
Thank you for that. And Lizzy, in closing, what is the next action that you and WildEarth Guardians are moving towards right now? And can you give us a timeline of how the audience here can get engaged?
Yeah. So my big thing is these APA petitions, like I was talking about. So I'm finalizing those. They're almost done. We're going to send them out to the agencies, and then we're going to be circulating them around. So if you sign up for action alerts by WildEarth Guardians, we will keep you up to date on when these petitions go out and how you can make your voice heard in support of that action. And that's to target those two federal agencies